How effective will Russia's mobilization be? Russia's invasion of Ukraine was meant to last a matter of days, or maybe a few weeks. Somehow, those weeks became months, seasons have come and gone, and Russia is now barely keeping up with the Ukrainian defense. In response, Russia, as they have often done throughout history, has turned to its huge population as its response when things start going wrong militarily. The large round of mobilization that came in September 2022 has made headlines not just in Russia, but around the world. Although the war is overwhelmingly popular throughout Russia, the response to the attempted draft of hundreds of thousands of citizens has often been met with hostility. In many countries, the idea of drafting civilians to be promptly sent to war is an inhumane government practice that is best left in decades past. Since the 1970s and the disaster of the Vietnam War, which was met with huge public resistance, countries around the world have slowly become more and more hostile to the idea of forcing citizens to fight. This is partly due to the rise in living standards throughout the world. People now have much more sheltered, comforted lives that aren't completely taken up by their job. In some respects, signing up for the army beforehand would be going from one bad place to another. Nowadays, though, the vast majority of people appreciate the better working conditions and the hours they have to themselves every day, and being at the front lines is a far cry from that. This is especially the case on Russia's front lines. Living standards and morale are abysmal, with the supplies of many daily essentials being reported to be even worse than what Russian prisoners get in prison. The fact that going to war for the war in Ukraine is seen as being treated worse than being imprisoned is part of the reason why so many Russian men have been willing to risk their imprisonment so that they can try and escape. If they knew they were going to fight on the front line with good equipment, be trained and paid well, and be compensated properly for their extremely risky efforts, then being obligated to join up may not be such a daunting proposition. As we have seen from the widespread response of preemptive desertion among Russian men, the idea of being pushed to the front lines remains extremely daunting. This huge gulf in standards between life at home and life on the front line is evidenced by the fact that Russian men from better backgrounds are more likely to flee than those from working-class backgrounds. For those who already have low living standards, the idea of playing Russian roulette with their lives and enduring a few grueling months to help possibly enrich Russia and therefore themselves isn't so awful. Those who are enjoying life at university or a high-paying job, on the other hand, have a much bigger chasm in front of them if military recruitment is to catch up with them. However, the lack of qualifications in the Russian military was sorely lacking even before the war started. Right from the invasion's very beginning, though, high-ranking Russian military personnel were being picked off like flies. The capacity of an army is very much limited if it doesn't have personnel with the right qualifications to lead it and provide it with technical and logistical support. With the rapid picking off of officers at the beginning of the war, Russia's ability to fight effectively has been severely limited in the months since. The mobilization is likely to be limited in its effect if there is still little qualified and potential for thought and leadership among those who are signed up. But it's not just the lack of qualifications in their leadership. Of course, that is lacking in Russia's army at this time. Despite the war's ongoing popularity throughout much of Russia's population, there is no disputing the fact that morale on the front lines is awful. Many of the forces were told that the invasion would be a quick success, and many were even convinced that they would be welcomed by Ukrainians wishing to be liberated with open arms. As time has gone on, it's grown more and more clear that not only is there nothing speedy about the war, but not even is there a guarantee of eventual success. The impressive defense Ukraine has put up speaks for itself. Unhappy soldiers don't make for an effective fighting force, and it looks likely that morale will only decrease further once conscripts hit the front line. Those who are forced into fighting are not going to be as enthusiastic about doing so as those who signed up to go and fight. Not only that, but there's been plenty of outrage among Russian men about how the conscripts have been chosen. When the mobilization announcement was made, the Kremlin painted a picture that there wouldn't be unnecessary discrimination about who was called up, as long as men had recent military experience and were still able to fight. However, it quickly became clear that there is a much more targeted approach going into the mobilization than that. There have been widespread reports that non-ethnic Russian groups have been targeted intensely by the conscription order. Whilst many of these regions and groups have military cultures of their own, that doesn't mean they're happy to sign up to be cannon fodder for the Russian people just because of their ethnicity or where they come from. A key message that Putin seems to have given out by the mobilization has been that he intends to protect ethnic Russians, especially those in the West. Instead, those from the less wealthy and more ethnically diverse areas are being conscripted first. It has been thought that much of the Russian population's support for the war so far has been because the government has done a good job of protecting them from its impact on everyday life. However, this pillar of support could rapidly fall if people and their fathers, brothers, and sons are taken from their homes and sent to risk their lives against their will. Putin had done such a good job until now of protecting everyday Russians from the inevitable economic impact that will eventually see living standards drop. The main benefit of doing so is that he retains the country's support while he wages his war. However, if the conscription is enough to start eroding public favor by itself, then the Ukraine front will be much harder to hold out. One of the huge benefits that the Kremlin enjoys when undergoing military operations of any scale is that they rarely have to worry about its domestic impact due to the lack of opposition forces and support of state media. However, those tools won't be enough necessarily to defend Putin from outrage against what many see as an unjust mobilization. Even if newspapers and politicians can convince many people that the war is for a just cause, this isn't the same as having to actually go and face that reality in person on the battlefields of Ukraine. Such a potential dip in public opinion could leave Putin, for the first time, fighting a war on the domestic front at the same time as trying to make military progress abroad. It is unlikely that the internal struggle will ever break out into such grand violence, but chaos at home certainly doesn't make for an effective war effort. This lack of popularity and morale is likely to cause far more chaos on the front line than it will domestically. A combination of bad leadership, unmotivated troops, and a lack of training certainly doesn't suggest victory is on its way anytime soon. And some reports indicate that the tiny training they will get will be absolutely awful. Most analysts say that conscripts will undergo just 2 weeks of training before being sent to the front line. That may be the amount of time you need to start learning to ride a bike or learn how to ask for a croissant in French. The skills to invade a country, though? Not a chance. Unfortunately for the people of Russia, the country's military tactic of throwing countless numbers of people to the front line, regardless of training, equipment, or motivation, far precedes Putin's reign. It is a tactic that most famously worked during World War II, when the Soviet Union lost an unfathomable amount of soldiers in fighting against Nazi Germany. During that time, there was again a huge lack of training and resources. The bodies were thrown forward time and time again at a rate that the German military was never able to keep up with. And this is a daunting prospect for Ukraine. However bad Russia's equipment is and whatever level of training soldiers get, there's no denying the huge amounts of people that it can call on in times of war. While some pictures indicate there are many people leaving the country since the mobilization announcement, these total figures are rather insignificant overall in comparison to the vastness of Russia's population. Sure, a few 100,000 fleeing people here and a fully booked flight out of the country there certainly made for eye-catching news and undermine the message of national unity. What they don't do is significantly dent the number of able-bodied men living in Russia. Especially when the troops already fighting are of such a low standard, it is less drastic for the Russian military to call up on untrained personnel, as its fighting tactics have often been adjusted for the low quality of its personnel. As Stalin once said about the huge population that the Russian state can call upon, "Quantity is quality all of its own." But this doctrine can only go so far, as the mobilization translates into more troops on the front line and the continuation of the Ukrainian war. We will see just how much the Kremlin can rely on the principle of quantity over quality. Sure, in a battle for vast swaths of Eastern Europe, as was the case in World War II, numbers can be extremely valuable. But when the fight is on a much smaller scale, especially against modern-day weapons made by NATO, relying on endless cannon fodder is far less effective. The area where it could feasibly end up having more of an effect is in the attitude back home. If people see that their friends and family are being sent off to fight without the training, equipment, or support to do so safely or effectively, then they're more likely to feel justified in turning against their government. If the provision of these things, consistently working equipment, or a spattering of competent qualified officials was available, even sporadically, then Russian citizens may feel less bitter about the mobilization. But it currently seems that the Russian military is struggling to meet even this minimum level. It's difficult to see how it could come much closer to providing acceptable levels of support to its troops in the near future. Economic isolation and waning support from its allies suggest that its resources aside from personnel are already close to drying up. And unlike with able-bodied men, they don't have a huge supply that they can fall back on. Many of the problems that mobilization will probably bring are just exaggerated versions of those that arose at the beginning of the war. As soon as it became obvious that the war wasn't going to be won in a matter of days, it became clear they had huge troubles with the incompetency of its high-ranking staff, low level of training capacity, and shocking logistical capabilities that make a waste of Russia's vast transport infrastructure. But despite the mess that Russia's mobilization is likely to be, we can hardly call it something to celebrate for the people of Ukraine. Its most likely effect will be to just drive the war on for longer. It barely increases the odds of Russia's victory, especially if the West keeps providing such huge amounts of support to Ukraine. But it does increase the likelihood of Russia's holding out in a war of attrition. So, if domestic unrest doesn't become too widespread in Russia and Ukraine continues to fight with such great support and morale, we could see this war continue for many more months. As time goes on, Russia will start running out of allies and economic breathing space. But one thing it is unlikely to run out of anytime soon is the amount of Russians Putin will send to the front lines to die as cannon fodder.